The city street buzzed with the frenetic energy of rush hour. Cars honked in frustration, their engines growling like restless beasts caught in a never-ending cycle of stop-and-go traffic. Pedestrians, some with faces creased in exhaustion, hurried to their destinations, their footsteps drowned by the cacophony of honking horns and the rhythmic hum of engines. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a sharp, unforgiving light that only amplified the heat of the asphalt. The air felt thick with the pressure of the crowd, a mixture of impatience and longing for the relief of the evening. Amidst this chaos, Nadia sat behind the wheel of her modest sedan, feeling like a small boat tossed in a storm. The discomfort in her lower back had become almost unbearable, and every turn of the wheel made her stomach tighten. Her third trimester had left her physically drained, but the excitement and nervousness about the upcoming birth of her baby kept her moving, even when her body screamed for rest. She glanced down at her watch. She was already running late for her doctor's appointment. The pregnancy was progressing without serious complications, but there were small things that weighed on her mind. The ache in her legs, the tightness of her chest, the anxiety that never quite went away. As the light turned green, Nadia pressed the gas pedal and gently steered her car into the flow of traffic, but her progress was slow, so typical for this time of day. A few more minutes and she would be at the clinic. A few more minutes until she could get out of this heat, off the crowded roads, and into the comforting calm of a doctor's office. But as fate would have it, the universe had other plans for her that afternoon. Suddenly, from her rear-view mirror, she saw the flashing red and blue lights. Her heart sank. She had always prided herself on being a cautious driver, especially now, with her pregnancy. But the thought of being pulled over added a new level of anxiety. With a resigned sigh, she pulled over to the side of the road, making sure she was as far from the curb as possible without blocking any other vehicles. Before she could even shift into park, the officer was already walking toward her. Officer Ahmed, a middle-aged man with a crumpled uniform and an air of irritation, approached her vehicle. His face was etched with the signs of a long, difficult shift. Eyes squinting against the sun, a slight frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was an unmistakable aura of someone who had spent too much time on the job and was, in his own words, sick of it all. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice sharp. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Nadia, trying to mask her own discomfort, took a deep breath and offered a polite smile. "No, officer, I'm not sure. You didn't stop fully at the sign back there," he said, pointing over his shoulder at the intersection they had just passed. "That's a violation, and I'm going to have to issue you a ticket." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She was already running late, and now this? She could feel the irritation and frustration building up in her chest, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Officer, I'm really sorry, but I didn't realize I didn't stop completely. I'm just on my way to my doctor's appointment. I'm pregnant, and I'm not feeling well." Officer Ahmed didn't even blink. His eyes narrowed, scanning her appearance with a dismissive gaze. Nadia, still holding the wheel, felt his eyes linger on her belly, and she could almost feel the judgment in the air. "Well, you should have stopped. It's your responsibility to follow the rules of the road, regardless of your condition." Nadia's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the first sharp edge of his attitude. She tried again, her voice softer, almost pleading. "Please, officer, I'm just trying to get to the doctor's office. It's just a few more blocks." "I don't care if you're trying to get to the moon. The law is the law." Officer Ahmed cut her off sharply. He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the staleness of his afternoon. "Now, show me your license and registration." A lump formed in Nadia's throat. She handed over the documents, her fingers trembling slightly as she passed them through the window. She could feel the weight of the situation, his increasing condescension, his dismissive attitude toward her, settling around her like a suffocating cloud. The officer glanced at the documents before flipping them back toward her. "I'll be issuing you a citation for the violation," he said flatly, almost as though he were reading from a script. Nadia's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her mind racing. She couldn't understand why this was happening. She wasn't looking for special treatment, but was it too much to expect a little empathy from someone in a position of authority? She felt as if she was shrinking in the seat of her car, the weight of the officer's words pressing down on her. The heat outside seemed to creep into the car, making the air feel thicker, suffocating. And then, just as she was about to speak up again, Officer Ahmed added something that struck at her core. "Seems like someone's got a little too much weight on her hands," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you're fit to drive, or should you be resting at home with your little bundle of joy?" The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, Nadia felt paralyzed, a sickening mixture of anger and humiliation twisting in her chest. She had hoped for a small gesture of understanding, a sign of kindness, but instead, she was met with ridicule. Her face flushed with shame, but she said nothing. The officer handed her the ticket, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can dispute this in court, but I don't think it'll do you much good. Have a nice day, ma'am." As the officer walked away, Nadia remained in the car for a few moments, trying to steady her breath. She felt a lump rise in her throat, the sting of tears threatening to spill. It wasn't just the ticket. It was the way it made her feel so small, so insignificant. She had been polite. She had tried to explain, but none of that mattered. The city street buzzed with the frenetic energy of rush hour. Cars honked in frustration, their engines growling like restless beasts caught in a never-ending cycle of stop-and-go traffic. Pedestrians, some with faces creased in exhaustion, hurried to their destinations, their footsteps drowned by the cacophony of honking horns and the rhythmic hum of engines. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a sharp, unforgiving light that only amplified the heat of the asphalt. The air felt thick with the pressure of the crowd, a mixture of impatience and longing for the relief of the evening. Amidst this chaos, Nadia sat behind the wheel of her modest sedan, feeling like a small boat tossed in a storm. The discomfort in her lower back had become almost unbearable, and every turn of the wheel made her stomach tighten. Her third trimester had left her physically drained, but the excitement and nervousness about the upcoming birth of her baby kept her moving, even when her body screamed for rest. She glanced down at her watch. She was already running late for her doctor's appointment. The pregnancy was progressing without serious complications, but there were small things that weighed on her mind. The ache in her legs, the tightness of her chest, the anxiety that never quite went away. As the light turned green, Nadia pressed the gas pedal and gently steered her car into the flow of traffic, but her progress was slow. So typical for this time of day. A few more minutes and she would be at the clinic. A few more minutes until she could get out of this heat, off the crowded roads, and into the comforting calm of a doctor's office. But as fate would have it, the universe had other plans for her that afternoon. Suddenly, from her rear-view mirror, she saw the flashing red and blue lights. Her heart sank. She had always prided herself on being a cautious driver, especially now, with her pregnancy. But the thought of being pulled over added a new level of anxiety. With a resigned sigh, she pulled over to the side of the road, making sure she was as far from the curb as possible without blocking any other vehicles. Before she could even shift into park, the officer was already walking toward her. Officer Ahmed, a middle-aged man with a crumpled uniform and an air of irritation, approached her vehicle. His face was etched with the signs of a long, difficult shift. Eyes squinting against the sun, a slight frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was an unmistakable aura of someone who had spent too much time on the job and was, in his own words, sick of it all. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice sharp. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Nadia, trying to mask her own discomfort, took a deep breath and offered a polite smile. "No, officer, I'm not sure. You didn't stop fully at the sign back there," he said, pointing over his shoulder at the intersection they had just passed. "That's a violation, and I'm going to have to issue you a ticket." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She was already running late, and now this? She could feel the irritation and frustration building up in her chest, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Officer, I'm really sorry, but I didn't realize I didn't stop completely. I'm just on my way to my doctor's appointment. I'm pregnant and I'm not feeling well." Officer Ahmed didn't even blink. His eyes narrowed, scanning her appearance with a dismissive gaze. Nadia, still holding the wheel, felt his eyes linger on her belly, and she could almost feel the judgment in the air. "Well, you should have stopped. It's your responsibility to follow the rules of the road, regardless of your condition." Nadia's breath caught in her throat. There was the first sharp edge of his attitude. She tried again, her voice softer, almost pleading. "Please, officer, I'm just trying to get to the doctor's office. It's just a few more blocks. I don't care if you're trying to get to the moon. The law is the law." Officer Ahmed cut her off sharply. He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the staleness of his afternoon. "Now, show me your license and registration." A lump formed in Nadia's throat. She handed over the documents, her fingers trembling slightly as she passed them through the window. She could feel the weight of the situation, his increasing condescension, his dismissive attitude toward her, settling around her like a suffocating cloud. The officer glanced at the documents before flipping them back toward her. "I'll be issuing you a citation for the violation," he said flatly, almost as though he were reading from a script. Nadia's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her mind racing. She couldn't understand why this was happening. She wasn't looking for special treatment, but was it too much to expect a little empathy from someone in a position of authority? She felt as if she was shrinking in the seat of her car, the weight of the officer's words pressing down on her. The heat outside seemed to creep into the car, making the air feel thicker, suffocating. And then, just as she was about to speak up again, Officer Ahmed added something that struck at her core. "Seems like someone's got a little too much weight on her hands," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you're fit to drive, or should you be resting at home with your little bundle of joy?" The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, Nadia felt paralyzed, a sickening mixture of anger and humiliation twisting in her chest. She had hoped for a small gesture of understanding, a sign of kindness, but instead, she was met with ridicule. Her face flushed with shame, but she said nothing. The officer handed her the ticket, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can dispute this in court, but I don't think it'll do you much good. Have a nice day, ma'am." As the officer walked away, Nadia remained in the car for a few moments, trying to steady her breath. She felt a lump rise in her throat, the sting of tears threatening to spill. It wasn't just a ticket. It was the way he had made her feel so small, so insignificant. She had been polite. She had tried to explain, but none of that mattered. On the other side of the world, Captain Zane was entrenched in the quiet tension of a military base, his days a relentless cycle of training drills, strategy sessions, and long hours spent in the gym. His uniform was impeccably pressed, his posture straight as an arrow, traits that spoke to the core of his identity. The discipline of military life had shaped him into a man who thrived in structure, who knew how to suppress his emotions and focus on the task at hand. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate. Yet, despite the demands of his duty, there was a constant pull in his heart, a quiet ache that gnawed at him when he allowed himself a moment of respite. Nadia, his wife, was always on his mind. Their small apartment back home, the soft laughter they shared over breakfast, the dreams of a family they had woven together. All of these things kept him going. The thought of their baby, their first child, filled him with pride and anticipation, but also an overwhelming sense of longing. He had missed the better part of Nadia's pregnancy, his time overseas stretching on like an endless horizon. The couple had exchanged countless messages over the past few weeks. Texts and videos that chronicled Nadia's pregnancy updates, the growing bump, the first kicks that made her smile with wonder. He knew she was nearing the final stages of her pregnancy, and he had been eagerly counting down the days until he would finally return home to be by her side. Despite the overwhelming pressures of his military life, Zane never forgot to send his wife messages of love and reassurance. The rhythm of their communication was almost sacred to him. Each message, each phone call, a reminder of what he was fighting for, what he was sacrificing. Nadia wasn't just his partner. She was his anchor, the one person who understood the weight he carried, the man he had become. It was late afternoon when Zane's phone buzzed, breaking the monotony of his training session. A quick glance at the screen told him it was Nadia. Her name shining brightly on his phone, but the call itself felt different. The tone of her messages had been upbeat for the past few days. So why did he sense a shift now? His heart quickened as he accepted the call, stepping away from his training group, seeking a quieter space. "Nadia?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. There was a long pause before her voice crackled through, distant and faint, as though she was trying to hold back tears. "Zane, I don't know what to do," she began, the words barely audible. "Something happened. I was pulled over by a cop." Zane felt a tightness in his chest. He'd heard of stories where pregnant women were harassed or mistreated, but hearing it happen to Nadia was something else entirely. His protective instincts, honed over years of military service, flared instantly. "What happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Her breath was shaky as she explained the situation, recounting the encounter with Officer Ahmed, his rude tone, the way he mocked her pregnancy, and the humiliating ticket he had issued. Each word sent a jolt of anger through Zane. He could hear Nadia's discomfort, the raw edge of vulnerability in her voice. He could picture her sitting there in the car, helpless and alone, and the rage within him began to swell. I don't know, Zane," Nadia continued, her voice cracking. He made me feel like I was nothing. I'm pregnant, Zane, and he didn't care. He just mocked me." Zane's hands clenched into fists, his mind flashing with images of that officer. The way he must have looked at Nadia, the condescension in his voice, the disregard for the woman carrying his child. "Listen to me, Nadia," Zane said, trying to rein in his rising fury. "I'll take care of this when I get home. You don't need to worry. You're safe now, okay? I promise you, this won't go unpunished." Nadia tried to reassure him, her voice soft but laced with lingering sadness. "I don't want you to get into trouble, Zane. Please, don't do anything. Just focus on your work." "I'm fine." Her words cut through him, a stark reminder of the love they shared, the love that had always been their strength. But Zane knew in his heart that this wasn't something he could simply brush off. He needed to act. Nadia was alone, vulnerable, and the idea that she had been humiliated in such a way while carrying their child made his blood boil. "I don't care about the consequences," Zane said, his voice low and dangerous. "I will deal with this. When I come home, this officer is going to answer for what he did." Nadia sighed, a tired, defeated sound. "I just want this to be over. I want everything to go back to normal." Zane wished he could be there to hold her, to shield her from everything that was hurting her. But all he could do was promise her justice, and that felt like a fragile reassurance at best. As the call ended, Zane stood in the middle of the training field, surrounded by his fellow soldiers, but for the first time he didn't notice them. His mind was elsewhere, racing with the image of Nadia sitting alone in that car, the sting of her words still ringing in his ears. The mission he had been focused on for weeks suddenly felt distant, almost irrelevant. His military training had taught him to stay in control, to maintain his focus no matter what personal emotions he was experiencing. But this was different. This was his wife. Zane paced a few steps, his boots kicking up the dust on the training ground. His mind whirled with thoughts of how to respond. He could feel the heat of the situation rising in his chest, his desire to lash out, to find this officer and make him regret his actions. But his military discipline told him that reaction was dangerous. He had learned the hard way that patience and control were paramount, that the chain of command, the rules of engagement, were not something to be ignored. Yet even as he stood there, wrestling with his emotions, his heart was screaming for action. He couldn't just sit idly by, knowing that Nadia was hurting. He needed to act, but how? Zane knew that he couldn't resolve the situation from afar, not without risking the wrath of his superiors or jeopardizing his position. He had to wait until he returned home, but the thought of leaving this unresolved gnawed at him. He hated the idea of doing nothing, of allowing Officer Ahmed to go on with his day, unaware that someone was coming for him. Still, despite his growing anger, Zane understood that this wasn't the battlefield. His mission wasn't just a fight for a cause. It was to protect the people he loved. And as much as he wanted to return home immediately, he had to wait. For now, the only thing he could do was plan. He straightened his posture, forcing his emotions into submission. This battle wasn't over. When he returned, he would take his wife's side and make sure Officer Ahmed understood exactly what it meant to face the consequences of his actions. Until then, Zane would wait, but his anger burned bright, and he was counting down the days until he could make things right. After what felt like an eternity, Zane finally returned home. His military unit had been granted a short leave, a rare break in a relentless schedule that had kept him far from his wife. The moment he stepped off the plane, the weight of anticipation hung in the air. He felt it in his chest. The nervousness, the eagerness, the longing to wrap his arms around Nadia, to be with her, to see her again after months of separation. The flight had been long. The time away from her had been grueling, but now he was here. The reunion was everything he had hoped for. Nadia, standing at the airport gate, her face glowing despite the fatigue, her hand resting on the curve of her swollen belly. The second their eyes met, Zane felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite control. He crossed the terminal in long strides, his boots echoing as he rushed toward her. Nadia's eyes welled up with tears as she reached for him, and they embraced tightly, the kind of embrace that conveyed everything they hadn't been able to say in their months apart. His strong arms wrapped around her, feeling the soft curve of her body beneath the fabric of her dress. He kissed her forehead, whispering how much he had missed her, how proud he was of her strength, and how happy he was to finally be home. But despite the joy of their reunion, there was a lingering tension between them. Zane could feel it in the way Nadia hesitated, in the slight tension in her voice when they spoke about the past few weeks. She had tried to shield him from the worst of it, but Zane knew better. The officer's harassment still lingered in the air between them, an unspoken reminder of the injustice Nadia had faced. The first night back, as Zane and Nadia sat together in their small living room, the weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. Nadia, her pregnancy close to term, was exhausted, but Zane could see the worry still clouding her eyes. She had tried to reassure him that she was fine, but Zane knew better than to let the matter go unresolved. "I'm going to take care of this," Zane said quietly, his voice firm. Nadia looked at him, her expression conflicted. "You don't have to, Zane," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's not worth the trouble. I don't want you to get hurt over this." Zane took her hand, squeezing it gently. He wasn't about to let Officer Ahmed get away with what he had done. Not to his wife, not to the woman he loved, and not to the mother of his child. But he knew that he needed to be smart about this. He couldn't act out of rage, no matter how much he wanted to. "I'm not going to escalate things violently, Nadia," he said, his tone serious but calm. "But I need to make sure this officer is held accountable. What he did to you is wrong. I'll make sure of that." Nadia sighed, her eyes downcast. "I just want this to go away. I don't want to make a big scene." "I understand," Zane said softly. "But sometimes the only way to make things right is to shine a light on them." The resolve in his voice was unwavering, and Nadia, despite her reluctance, knew that Zane wasn't going to drop it. The protective instinct in him had already kicked into overdrive, and once Zane made up his mind, there was no turning back. Determined to approach this carefully and methodically, Zane wasted no time in reaching out to his network of friends, military contacts, former colleagues, and trusted allies. Some were within the police force. Others had legal backgrounds, but all of them had one thing in common. They understood the importance of justice and integrity. Zane wasn't going to leave this in the hands of bureaucracy. He would gather his own resources and start his own investigation. Through his police contacts, he quickly learned that Officer Ahmed was known for being abrasive and, at times, overstepping his authority. There had been murmurs of complaints about his conduct, but nothing had ever come of them. His superiors had swept them under the rug. Zane's blood boiled as he pieced this together. Officer Ahmed wasn't just a bad apple in a few isolated incidents. He had a pattern of behavior that indicated something far more serious. This made Zane's determination even stronger. He made a list of things to investigate, starting with gathering witness statements. If there had been others who had been harassed or mistreated by Ahmed, Zane wanted to find them. His allies began canvassing the area around the intersection where the incident had taken place, knocking on doors, asking questions. He also reached out to local businesses to see if anyone had CCTV footage that might have captured the exchange between Nadia and the officer. Back at home, Zane kept Nadia updated on his progress. She had reluctantly agreed to let him investigate, but still felt torn. Part of her wanted to bury the memory of the encounter and move on, but another part of her wanted justice. She didn't want her experience to be something that was simply forgotten, swept under the rug. "I'm doing this for you, Nadia," Zane reassured her during one of their nightly conversations. "I know this is hard, but we need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. This is bigger than just us." Nadia nodded, though her face remained troubled. She wanted to believe in Zane's mission, but the pain of the encounter still felt too raw to address head-on. As the days passed, Zane's investigation began to gain traction. One by one, witnesses came forward, some more willing than others to speak out against Officer Ahmed. A woman who had witnessed the incident and had been standing nearby described how the officer had been unnecessarily harsh, even shouting at Nadia in a manner that seemed unprovoked. Another man, a delivery driver who had seen the exchange from his truck, reported similar observations. Both of them confirmed that Nadia had not been in violation of any traffic law significant enough to warrant the kind of treatment she received. But the real breakthrough came when Zane and his allies reviewed the local traffic camera footage from the intersection. Although the angle was not perfect, they were able to spot the moment when Officer Ahmed first approached Nadia's car. The footage showed him walking up to her vehicle with an aggressive stance, and his tone could be heard in the background as he began raising his voice. The footage didn't show the full extent of the verbal exchange, but it was enough to corroborate the witness testimonies. Next, Zane and his team dug deeper into Officer Ahmed's record. They discovered a troubling pattern of complaints against him over the years. Other drivers who had reported being mistreated, citizens who had filed formal complaints about his aggressive behavior. The complaints had been dismissed each time, and Ahmed had faced no serious consequences for his actions. Zane's heart sank as he saw the extent of Ahmed's behavior. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a troubling history of abuse of power. Zane's anger flared, but he kept it in check. This was the evidence he needed to move forward. With the evidence piling up, Zane now felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his wife anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had been wronged by this officer. His mission had expanded beyond personal retribution. It had become about exposing a corrupt officer and ensuring justice for all those who had suffered under his rule. Now, with the evidence in hand, Zane began to formulate his next move. The next step was to present everything to the authorities and ensure that Officer Ahmed was held accountable. But Zane knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The day of the confrontation arrived. Zane had spent days meticulously planning this meeting, carefully calculating every step. He had his military contacts on his side, trusted allies in law enforcement who had gathered a mountain of evidence against Officer Ahmed. The investigation was airtight, and now it was time for the man responsible for humiliating his wife to face the consequences of his actions. Zane knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. Officer Ahmed, from what he had gathered, was not the type to back down, especially when confronted with the possibility that his long-standing behavior was being exposed. But Zane wasn't there to make friends. He was there for one reason: to hold Ahmed accountable for his actions. The meeting took place in the back offices of the local police precinct. It was a small, sterile room, filled with the faint smell of coffee and stale paperwork. Zane sat at one side of the table, composed and calm, his uniform pressed and neat, his posture sharp. He was a very image of military discipline, his every movement controlled, every breath purposeful. On the other side of the table sat Officer Ahmed, disheveled, defensive, his eyes shifting between Zane and the small stack of documents laid before him. At first glance, the contrast between the two men was striking. Zane's presence radiated quiet authority, while Ahmed exuded a defensive arrogance, as though he were accustomed to intimidating others rather than being confronted. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air electric with the promise of a showdown. Zane broke the silence first, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Ahmed, I'm here to discuss an incident involving my wife, Nadia. I've gathered evidence that suggests your behavior that day was not only inappropriate but unlawful. This is your chance to explain yourself." Ahmed leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, an arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I did my job. If your wife had obeyed the rules, none of this would have happened." Zane's eyes narrowed, but he remained calm. He didn't rise to the bait. "Your job, officer, is to enforce the law with respect and professionalism, not to belittle and harass people, especially not when they're in a vulnerable state." Ahmed scoffed. "Vulnerable? She's a grown woman. And I was just doing my job." Zane leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but with an edge that cut through the room. "You weren't just doing your job, officer. I've spoken to witnesses. We've reviewed the traffic footage, and we've seen a disturbing pattern of complaints about you." Ahmed's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. "Complaints? Are you threatening me? I've been doing this job for over 10 years. No one's ever complained about me before." "I don't care about your tenure," Zane countered. "The fact is, you've been abusing your power for far too long. It stops now." The room fell silent for a moment. Zane's words had landed, and for the first time, Officer Ahmed seemed unsure of himself. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but I did nothing wrong that day," Ahmed said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. Zane placed the evidence on the table. Statements from witnesses, the traffic footage, and the internal complaints that had been buried for years. "I don't believe that," he said, his voice unwavering. "Your actions that day weren't just a lapse in judgment. They were an abuse of your authority." The tension in the room escalated as Zane continued to push. His military training had taught him how to remain calm under pressure, how to analyze the situation and make the right moves. He knew that Ahmed's arrogance was a sign of insecurity. People like him rarely understood the consequences of their actions until someone forced them to face the truth. Zane's voice remained level, but each word felt like a measured strike. "I've spoken to the people who were there that day. The man in the delivery truck who saw you berating my wife. The woman who witnessed the entire exchange. They've all spoken up. They've all told me what happened." Ahmed shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flickering from Zane to the evidence in front of him. His defensiveness was beginning to crack. "This is ridiculous. People misunderstand what happened." Zane leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "They didn't misunderstand anything, officer. You mocked her. You raised your voice. You didn't just enforce the law. You humiliated her. And that's why we're here." The power dynamic in the room had shifted. Zane had remained calm and collected, while Ahmed was growing increasingly agitated, his defenses crumbling with each new piece of evidence. Zane's military discipline contrasted sharply with Ahmed's flustered defensiveness. It was as though the officer had never faced real accountability before, and now, the walls were closing in on him. "Listen," Ahmed said, his voice rising, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I'm just trying to do my job. If your wife felt bad, that's on her. I didn't do anything wrong." Zane's eyes burned with intensity, but his voice remained unwavering. You don't get to decide that, officer. You don't get to decide who gets humiliated and who doesn't. My wife deserves respect, and so do the countless others you've harassed over the years. This stops now. The room seemed to tighten with every word. The others in the room, Zane's allies, watched in silence, their expressions hardening as they saw the officer's lies begin to unravel. Zane's military contacts, once his silent support, were now fully engaged, their focus on Ahmed, making it clear that there would be no escape. For a moment, Officer Ahmed looked like he might explode, his fists clenched at his sides, his face flushed with anger. But then, something in his posture shifted. He exhaled deeply, the fight draining from him as reality sank in. He had been backed into a corner, and there was no way out. In the end, Officer Ahmed was left with no choice but to face the consequences. Zane's allies, including the internal affairs officers, had already gathered enough evidence to suspend him from duty. The department, though unwilling to take more drastic action immediately, had promised to conduct a thorough investigation into the numerous complaints against him. Zane stood up, his posture still perfect, his expression resolute. "You've been given a warning, officer. A suspension. But let me be clear. If you ever harass my wife again, or if you misuse your power in any other way, I will ensure you are permanently removed from duty. There will be no second chances." Ahmed didn't say a word as Zane's voice rang out, his words carrying the weight of authority. For the first time, Officer Ahmed realized that his actions had consequences, that he had crossed a line, and now he would be held accountable. As Zane turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "You're not untouchable, officer. Not anymore." With that, Zane walked out of the room, his shoulders straight and his head high. He had won. Justice had been served. Nadia would be able to breathe easier now, knowing that the man who had tried to break her spirit would face the consequences of his actions. It wasn't the end of the story. Zane knew that. The department's investigation would continue, and Officer Ahmed would likely face more repercussions in the future. But for now, Zane had done what he set out to do. He had stood up for his wife, for justice, and he had shown that no one, not even those in positions of power, was above the law. In the days following the confrontation, Nadia felt an emotional shift she hadn't anticipated. The initial wave of relief that came with knowing Officer Ahmed would face consequences for his actions gradually gave way to something deeper: empowerment. The trauma of the incident was still present, but it no longer defined her. Zane's unwavering support had been a pillar for her, but she now recognized something within herself, strength she didn't know she had. Sitting quietly one morning, cradling her swollen belly, Nadia reflected on how far she had come. The incident with Ahmed, though humiliating and distressing, had ignited something within her. Before Zane's return, when the harassment had first occurred, Nadia had felt helpless, alone, and vulnerable. She had been trying to simply get to her doctor's appointment, feeling physically uncomfortable, and suddenly she was made to feel small and powerless. But now, in the quiet moments at home, she saw herself differently. She was carrying life within her, preparing to bring a child into the world, and in that role alone, she had strength. She had fought through pregnancy complications, the challenges of being a woman in a world that too often tried to silence her, and she had survived. The experience with Ahmed had not broken her. It had made her stronger. The harassment had been an awful experience, yes, but it had also revealed a deeper reservoir of courage within herself. Nadia no longer felt like a passive victim of circumstance. She had spoken up, had stood up for herself, and had fought back. It was empowering to see how much Zane's trust in her had helped her trust her own voice. She still remembered the anger and pain that had initially surged through her when she first called Zane. But now, reflecting on everything that had transpired, she felt proud. Proud of how Zane had fought for her, proud of her decision to let him act, and proud of how much she had learned through the process. She had found her voice. She wasn't just a woman who had been harassed on the side of the road anymore. She was a woman who had fought for justice, who had stood up for her dignity, and who had, with the support of her husband, held a man in power accountable. The resolution of the incident had brought more than just legal closure for Nadia. It had given her a renewed sense of confidence in her own abilities and in the partnership she shared with Zane. In many ways, their relationship had been tested by the experience, but in the end, it had grown stronger, more resilient. As Nadia's pregnancy entered its final stages, there was a new sense of harmony between them. The stress of the confrontation had brought them closer, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally and mentally. Zane's protective instincts had been strong, but it was his respect for Nadia's autonomy that had impressed her most. Through it all, he had treated her as an equal partner, listening to her concerns, valuing her input, and supporting her as she navigated the emotional challenges that came with the pregnancy and the harassment. In turn, Nadia had learned to trust in her own strength. At first, she had thought she would have to defer to Zane's decisions, that his experience and authority would be the guiding light. But through the months of conflict and resolution, Nadia had discovered that she could stand her ground too, that her voice mattered, and that together, they could face anything. The experience had not only made her more confident as a woman, but had also solidified her belief in the importance of shared responsibility in their relationship. As Zane and Nadia prepared for the birth of their baby, they shared quiet moments of reflection. Their love was no longer just about comfort and security. It was now grounded in mutual respect and a shared sense of empowerment. Their relationship was stronger than ever, built on the knowledge that they could face adversity and overcome it together. They had already proven that in more ways than one. Zane had been her rock throughout it all, but Nadia had also been his. The bond they shared wasn't just one of love. It was one of respect, partnership, and a shared commitment to supporting one another no matter what. As the days passed, Nadia's thoughts often turned to the bigger picture, to the abuse of power by those in positions of authority, and to the importance of standing up for what's right. She realized that her experience was just one in a long line of similar stories. Too often, those in power, whether it was the police or any other authority figure, abused that power, using it to intimidate, belittle, and control. Officer Ahmed had been a reminder of that truth, a man who had allowed his position to go to his head. But what mattered most wasn't that he had abused his power. It was that, in the end, he had been held accountable. The department had taken action, albeit reluctantly at first, and Ahmed's behavior had been exposed. For Nadia, the resolution had not just been about stopping one man's misconduct. It had been about sending a broader message. Abuse of power would not go unchallenged. In the weeks that followed, Nadia began to reflect on the societal structures that allowed for such abuses to continue unchecked. Women often faced a unique kind of vulnerability, especially when they were at the mercy of someone who could manipulate authority for their own benefit. Yet, the more Nadia thought about her own experience, the more she realized how important it was to fight back. She had learned that standing up against abuse wasn't just about the immediate confrontation. It was about shifting the narrative. It was about showing others, especially women, that they had power too. Her own journey, from the frightened woman who had been intimidated by an officer's arrogance to the empowered woman who had stood up for justice, was a reflection of the larger battle that was happening in society. Every time someone stood up against injustice, no matter how small, they contributed to a growing movement that couldn't be ignored. Nadia wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of a wave of change, a force that demanded to be seen and heard. The birth of her child became symbolic of this new chapter in her life. Her baby would grow up in a world where his mother wasn't afraid to speak out, to defend herself, to protect those she loved. The legacy she hoped to leave for her child was not one of fear, but of courage, of standing up against injustice, of using one's voice to right wrongs, and of never backing down when it mattered most. The soft hum of hospital machines filled the air as Nadia lay on the bed, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly. The room was quiet except for the faint sounds of nurses and doctors moving about, preparing for the arrival of their baby. Zane sat beside her, his hand clasped firmly around hers, his eyes filled with the kind of tenderness that only a father-to-be could express. As the hours passed, the anticipation of the birth seemed to transform the space around them into something sacred, a place where, despite all the chaos and uncertainty they had faced, they were now united in their love and shared hope for the future. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotional highs and lows, but now, in this hospital room, they were finally on the cusp of something new, something beautiful. Nadia smiled softly, gazing up at Zain, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. The harassment by Officer Ahmed, the emotional toll, the pain of feeling powerless, seemed so distant now. It had felt like an eternity ago, yet in a way, it had shaped her, had made her stronger, had made them both stronger. "Can you believe we're here?" Nadia whispered, her voice laced with emotion. Zain leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I can hardly wait to meet him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been through so much, but now it's all worth it." Nadia nodded, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. She wasn't just a woman who had been humiliated on the side of the road anymore. She had fought for herself, and through her resilience, she had fought for justice. She had stood tall when it mattered most. And Zain had stood with her, not just as her protector, but as an equal partner, offering his unwavering support. Together, they had faced a storm, and now, as they awaited the birth of their child, they felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the strength they had found in one another. The sound of a baby's first cry echoed through the hospital room, and Nadia's heart soared. As they gazed at their newborn son, their world seemed to come into perfect focus. This tiny life, the love they had shared, and the challenges they had overcome had brought them to this moment. The tears that fell from Nadia's eyes were not tears of pain, but of profound joy and fulfillment. Empowerment had become Nadia's new truth. She had learned that standing up for herself was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for every woman, for anyone who had ever felt silenced or ignored. Justice, she had realized, was not just about law. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice and knowing that with courage and support, it was possible to make a difference. As she held their son in her arms, she knew that she would raise him to understand the power of kindness, strength, and justice, values that had become the very foundation of their family. She was no longer a victim. She was a fighter, a mother, and a woman who would always stand for what was right. And in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by love and hope, Nadia realized that the greatest victory of all was the strength to stand tall and the courage to keep fighting for a better world.